Hello everyone, my name is Dr. John Gross and welcome to another GIS lecture video. This lecture video is the second video in our series talking about what is GIS. And what I want to do in this video is sort of talk about at a high level the two different meanings behind the acronym GIS and try to disentangle some of that ambiguity and give definitions for both. So at a high level, right, you will often see people say, oh, GIS. GIS as an acronym standing for one of two things. And this is where the ambiguity comes from. So there is one set, which is the hardware perspective. Which says that GIS stands for Geographic Information System, or systems, depending on who you talk to. So the G, the I, and the S, Geographic Information System. And the reason I say this is the hardware perspective is because, as is implied here with the word system, right, this sort of idea or conceptualization of GIS relies almost exclusively on the idea of GIS as simply being a mixture of hardware and software on a computer that allow you to analyze spatial data, right? So from this perspective, right, a geographic information system is a combination of hardware and software that allow for the analysis / distribution of spatial data. Right, so from this hardware perspective, GIS is basically relegated to knowing how a particular combination of hardware and software work to be able to meaningfully produce, analyze, and distribute spatial data. So this would basically be cartography software, right? So from the hardware perspective, the S stands for system meaning a combination of hardware and software. And in the case of geographic information, meaning that this hardware and software is primarily oriented towards the analysis and distribution of spatial data. Right? But that's not the only perspective when you see GIS. You will also see GIS from the science perspective. Right? And so from the science perspective, right, it's still geographic information. But instead of systems, the S stands for science. Right? Geographic information science. Now, in all fairness, there has been a push, especially recently, for there to be a distinction between GIS, the system, and GIS, the science, with a lot of people saying if they're talking about the science, what they do is GIS, and then they'll put a little CI for GI science. However, there are a lot of people that still use these two perspectives or don't differentiate between these two perspectives when they use the acronym GIS. So just be aware that there is a hardware perspective dealing with explicitly talking about the combination of hardware and software. And there are also a lot of people who use GIS when talking about the science perspective. So what makes the science perspective different from the hardware perspective? So I could give a definition like I did up here, but I think the science perspective is actually best explained with a diagram. So on the one hand, right, we have the computer, right, comp or computer. On the other hand, right, we have data or spatial data. And then on the third hand, right, we have the user or the analyst or the specialist, right? And so what we get these four regions of overlap. We have this region in the middle here. We have this region here. This region here. And this region here. Right? And so if we think about it conceptually, right, each one of these regions means something different. So in the middle, obviously, this is the goal of, right, this is GIS from the science perspective, so I'll put the little CI here, right? This is what we mean when we say GI science, right? It is the intermixing of the computational hardware, the software, and the user, so the analyst. Right. If we look just at the overlap between the computer and the spatial data, right, this right here, this is the GIS from the hardware perspective, right? This is what we think of when you talk about, oh, I'm going to learn how a GIS works, right? You're learning how a computer interfaces with the spatial data. If we talk just about the overlap between users and spatial data, right, this would be fields such as surveying, right, where you're collecting spatial data, but you're not using spatial data, right? You're not interacting with the computer to make meaningful decisions. And then finally, right, if all we do is we look at the overlap between the computer and the user, this would be where you have fields like IT and software development, right? So hopefully you can see from this relatively simple diagram, right, the way that these three components, the hardware, the data, and the user, come together and overlap to produce GIS from the science perspective, as opposed to the more narrow definition where we say GIS is a system, meaning it is just the hardware that is used to deal with analysis and distribution. So hopefully this makes sense, these two different perspectives. By and large, when I'm talking about GIS, I largely tend to fall into the science perspective because I feel like there is more to GIS than just understanding how a particular system or hardware works. And one of the things that you gain from the science perspective, to quote, famous scientists, right, that geographic information science really allows you to not only understand how the hardware works, but it also gives you tools to understand how these hardware and software interplay with society and how society interplays with them, as well as how we're able to take these tools and apply them more broadly to a wide range of different applications. So hopefully this makes sense, the idea of what GIS is. In the next video, what I want to do is I want to just take a brief aside and talk about this spatial data, because I think it's important, even at a very basic level, to understand what makes spatial data different from the data that you might see in other places. So as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.